So this is our final session in our very exciting 4-part series on consumer duty. This is obviously really crucial. So this is part 4 of our great sessions. So today we're going to be covering the consumer support outcome. It's going to be a Q&A panel hosted by a lot of our excellent Thistle Initiatives colleagues. So if we'll go to the next slide, I think, should we get started? We'll get started fully now. So we're about 11 o'clock and 30 seconds in. So I'm Jess, the head of financial crime. I will be moderating today. So I head up the financial crime team here, but we're not here to talk about financial crime. We're here to talk about consumer duty. So we've got all of the excellent speakers on the other side. So I'll let them introduce themselves. So we've got Anthony Corner, who is one of the managers in our payment services team. Anthony, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'll be very quick. Thanks, Jess. So as Jess mentioned, I'm a manager in our payment services team. I recently joined Thistle from the FCA about 3 or 4 months ago, and kind of was at the coalface in when consumer duty was being developed within the FCA. So kind of unique insight on that as well. But looking forward to having a chat today as well.
So Anthony's moved over from the FCA, moved over from the dark side to join us. So welcome. And we've also got Matt, our head of credit and mortgages. A little intro, Matt.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jess, and welcome everybody. So I'm Matt. I head up the credit and mortgages team. We also do bits of insurance as well. So our focus is largely to support firms, whether that be new to market firms or existing firms across all of those different spaces. Providing auditing, ad hoc advice, ranging from, as I said, smaller firms, startups, all the way through to very well-established firms.
Amazing, yes. And then last but not least, we've got Keith, our compliance and technical manager. Intro from Keith, please.
Thanks so much, Jess. Yes, as Jess has mentioned, I'm compliance and technical manager for Thistle and for its regulated sister firm, Resolution Compliance Limited. I provide compliance advice pretty much across the board, with the emphasis being on advice given to funds and investment firms. But as mentioned, I'm prepared to turn my hand to any sector that I'm needed to advise on.
Perfect. You're our excellent in-house expert, which is amazing. So to briefly introduce Thistle then, we are a specialist governance, risk and compliance consultancy. We've been in the industry for over 10 years now, a good decade. Our team, we've got a load of expert compliance consultants, and we guide firms through a lot of different things, from sort of FCA authorization processes, a lot of ongoing advice and support. So we cover the full breadth of the regulated financial services industry. We help firms implement new and changing regulations. It's very complicated, so we're always here to help. So I think we are going to dive in now to a little bit about the consumer support outcome. So I think Anthony, our ex-FCA, is going to introduce us a little bit to this outcome itself.
Yes, I am. So from our perspective, the consumer support outcome aims for firms to provide a level of support that meets the needs of consumers throughout their relationship with the firm. Communication channels should be obvious, and it must be made clear that if a product is designed for a particular group, then it may not suit everyone's needs. I think the important thing to note here is that there's the point around throughout the relationship with the firm. So firms are often very easy to contact and engage with when you're onboarding or engaging with new customers. However, when dealing with issues experienced by customers or even allowing customers to leave their service, it's often a little bit more difficult to get in contact with the people you want to. So you need to put yourself in the position of the consumer and understand what you would want to expect in that scenario, particularly when often the case there's large sums of money involved too.
Did you write this quote on the screen as well whilst you were there?
I did, yeah.
Amazing. So we're getting some insights right from the coalface here. Anything more to add on this quote, or nicely covered?
All good, I think.
All good. All right. So before we jump into the proper sort of Q&A part of this panel, the real meat of this panel, I have to run through some very boring but crucial housekeeping points. So it'll be either at the top or the bottom of your screen. We have a Q&A button. So if you have any questions, pop them in there. We will try to get through some of them today, but if there are any questions that we don't get through, we will reach out or try to speak to you afterwards. There is a chat button, but don't use that one. We're just going to stick to the Q&A. So if you do pop any questions in the chat, we will not be looking at that function. So today, for the actual meat of the session, we have selected 3 of the FCA's questions to unpack, as well as a couple of questions that have already come through from the audience, which is amazing. So we'll jump into a few of these really interesting questions then. So I think the first one was for Matt on your side. So I think you can now see all of our lovely faces. So how have you satisfied yourself that the quality and availability of any post-sale support you have is as good as your pre-sale support? So how could firms sort of satisfy themselves that that quality and availability is there?
Great. No, look, I think just to cover quickly, just to say it's important that regardless of whether it's pre or post-sale, the FCA doesn't require firms to have prescriptive communication channels and support channels. I think that's really important to say. So really it's the assessment that needs to be made by the firm as to the customer base, the needs of the particular customer, and then reflect that in the way in which those, establish that in certain communication channels and support channels which are relevant to them. You know, that might include telephone, email, in-branch services, text, written communication, video calls, whatever it might be. You know, you've got such a host of different ways in which you can support customers now and communicate with them. So the assessment there is really important. And I think as well, just to touch on the flexibility of that as well, we've covered vulnerability quite a few times in the last 3 sessions, but the flexibility of those support channels is so important, and I'm sure some of the other panelists will come on to some of that aspects in a second. But I just wanted to stress all of those points there before we then touched on sort of post-sale. I think, Anthony, you picked up on it you know, quite well at the start there, in terms of the FCA has seen historically, and we have seen historically, in all fairness, that less support has or less resourcing and investment has been placed on post-sale communication channels and support channels. It being seen as, right, well, we've got them on board as a customer, we don't perhaps need to focus on them as much as perhaps bringing in new customers. So it's something that, as I said, has been seen relatively frequently by the FCA. Certainly when we've done any supervision enforcement work, it tends to be a bit of a sticking point. So it's really important that these particular aspects are focused on. And you know, that's evidenced through the FCA's, one of the FCA's 10 questions being focused on this particular item. I think in order to make sure it's as effective, and I've sort of touched upon it already, that the investment needs to be made into these structures, and you need both experienced enough staff and quality individuals who are able to run those post-sale channels, as well as the investment in the particular customer journeys as well. So the customer journeys, for example, if they're digital, you know, it's not just a case of having great onboarding journeys, but actually the post-sale environment where customers are able to communicate and ask questions around particular aspects of whatever the product and services that's being offered is so important, and actually can be somewhere where we found firms to drop the ball a little bit. An example might be, you know, having an online digital journey, but trying to stick with the digital journey and not really encouraging or allowing people to perhaps speak to someone in person, and only allowing them to speak to someone, you know, over a text chat or something like that. And just by having a number relevant available to them and not difficult to find, makes the whole process a lot easier should someone struggle with those sort of post-sale channels of communication and support. So that's a kind of important aspect to pick up on there. The focus should be on consumer retention and not just on new customers, as I mentioned, and really that sort of stems from a top-down approach to making sure at board level, at management level, these are things that are regularly communicated, evidenced, and then that's obviously disseminated with whatever the relevant controls look like on the back of that. So again, really important. And in order to understand you know, actually how this is, how you know, consumer support is working, operating on the fundamental levels, I think we need to touch back to what we discussed last week, which was around testing and monitoring. You'll be able to see a very robustly answered question from last week on exactly how we test and monitor. But testing and monitoring your post-sale consumer support outcomes with things like feedback surveys, complaints data, looking at root cause analysis is so important, and that's what's going to give you the evidence there in order to make sure that your post-sale communications and support are as good as your pre-sale. So it's using those feedback loops to really understand everything. I think just another really quick point to touch on there is that when you're testing all of this, really the testing should be done prior to any communication channel or support channel being rolled out. So the testing happens first and then it's rolled out afterwards. And that might be you select a control group, you roll testing out to them before then. It might be a script, for example, and you test it on them before then allowing your frontline staff to roll it out to the wider consumer base. So it comes down to testing and monitoring, making sure you understand it, but investing as well into post-sale.
What a fountain of knowledge there. There are so many points you brought out. So there's a lot about, don't forget about post-sale. Onboarding may be fun, but really think about that post-sale. And actually, if you're thinking about the retention part and you're bringing this support outcome in, it's of commercial value as well, right? Ultimately, if you manage to get this right. And I think you also touched on a number of things around vulnerability as well. So this all comes in here and leads us nicely on to our next question as well, which actually came through for Anthony. So this one is, what assessment have you made about whether your customer support is meeting the needs of customers with those characteristics of vulnerability? So lots of things that we've already talked about there. So what we go into a bit more specifics then. So what data, MI, customer feedback is really then being used to support this assessment? I think, Anthony, can you jump in on this one?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. So I think when you're making an assessment as to whether your customer support is indeed meeting the needs of customers with those characteristics, we need to consider those characteristics first. So the FCA has noted the drivers of vulnerability as poor health, experiencing negative life events, low financial resilience, or even a low capacity to engage with certain financial products as well. So when we're talking about poor health, the needs need to be accounted for by making support accessible and varied. Customers with disabilities, for example, may impact their ability to interact with certain types of support channels. So ensuring there's something available for persons with all disabilities and abilities is really imperative in this space as well. Positive feedback from customers in this bracket who've achieved no more and no less than what they're looking for is something to look for in terms of actual MI. And that's feedback that you can collect as and when it's received from customers as well. If, for example, an individual has had a life event that could have a significant impact on their ability to make rational decisions, that needs to be identified and catered for as well. So, for example, if unusual payments are made or if unusual activities noted in an account, it needs to be investigated to determine whether the individual is in the right state of mind to be making such interactions. Obviously, that's got a bit of a lever over into your area as well, Jess, with financial crime and unusual payments being made and stuff. But either way, it needs to be investigated. And further, if a customer mentions when you're having communications with them something specific about a life event that could impact their ability to think rationally, I think that's something that also needs to be taken into account too. For those with low financial resilience, they have very little margin for error when making financial decisions. So, customers need to be made aware at every stage of the process via these support functions of exactly what they're signing up for, how much it's going to cost them, what the cost is to opt out of these services and how easy that is to do. So customers, as I say, can't afford to make a mistake. They need to have the comfort that what they're buying is exactly right for them. And like I said earlier on, it's no more and no less than what they're looking for. And finally, on the kind of low capacity side or the understanding of a product of an individual is signing up for, if there's a language barrier, for example, then a potential customer at a financial services firm might sign up to the wrong thing, or they're not entirely sure what they're going for. A firm needs to make reasonable adjustments to bridge that gap to ensure that customers have a proper understanding of the product, and that is sufficient as well. So in general, I think, particularly in my space in kind of e-money and payments, there's a lot of customers who may not be able to get access to a kind of traditional bank account. Therefore, there's an inherently more vulnerable customer base than would otherwise be the case. And that's something that firms in this space need to be aware of from the outset and have those sufficient support channels in place to assist as well.
Mm. Yeah, quite often in the payments and e-money space, their product is specifically designed to support those vulnerable customers. So they really, really need to take a lot of these into consideration for sure. Okay, I mean, moving on to the next question, Keith, we have not left you out. There is a question for you next, and this specifically moving away a little bit from the payments and e-money space. This one is specifically about IFAs in your space. So where do you see the main risks to achieving and demonstrating this good client support outcome within your space, specifically with the IFAs?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jess. This is, I think, a very good question across the board, and certainly is not going to have unique application to IFAs. To answer it, we've had a look back at some of the documentation the FCA has produced in its final guidance, which I really commend to anyone listening, at FG 22.5, which really gives a tremendous amount of background information and stuff you wouldn't necessarily have thought of in relation to all four of the outcomes. But for client support, there's quite a bit. And the key thing that is put across to firms is whether consumer support works at the same standards and levels of expectation to deliver customer outcomes, good customer outcomes, as firms apply to their revenue and sales generating processes. This is, I think, a natural tendency, really, that the firms will concentrate on sales and revenue, especially in difficult times, whereas the expectation must be that customer support is at the same level of effort that's put in. We've got a few specific points as regard risk. I would mention particularly there the use of various support channels online, face-to-face and so on, whether the risk can be that the focus is too much placed onto one channel, such as online, where there may be factors which will prevent certain users from using that particular channel effectively. Another risk area would be failure to monitor. It's a vital point that firms, and this is part of the overall expectation clearly of the consumer duty, that the outcome that firms are trying to achieve is monitored and support, the support outcome no less, that firms should be looking at feedback, signs from whatever source they may come, to try and be clear that the support they're providing is of the standards. Vulnerability is a risk. We've talked about that in previous sessions on webinars, but so I'm not going to, I think, go into that now, but the failure to respond flexibly and to think carefully about duties towards vulnerable customers is I think, a significant risk, and that we've had discussions about this, and as I say, in previous sessions. There are a few others. Those are the main points. We are also aware that the risk identified by the FCA is about what are called friction points and nudges, that is, barriers to acting in the client's full interests, and that's a significant risk, whether advertently or inadvertently, that those pinch points and areas of difficulty prevent the outcome being given that one would expect. There are others. Those I think are the main things we can talk about if required. Some of the other points, and it's also possible, as I said, to take those points from the IFA sphere and apply them elsewhere as would be reasonable.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. This is across the board for sure. So I think the key things that Keith is saying is read the guidance for one, and two, check out the recordings of our previous sessions that cover vulnerable customers as well. I'm sure we can share them towards the end, because that will help you with some of the risks, and also make sure you're monitoring for sure. So actually just a little bit then more into the kind of practical side of this this part of consumer duty. So really looking then about how to embed these changes is the next question. So how do we start? There's lots of changes here. There's lots of new data points, lots of new MI, lots of new things to monitor. How do you embed these changes into BAU? And this is a question for Anthony, this one.
So all firms should have or be very close to finalise their consumer duty implementation plan, given that the deadline is fast approaching.
Very fast.
Ultimately, the board of the firm needs to be the ones to take overall responsibility for ensuring consumer duty is embedded into BAU of the firm. So steps that they can look to do can include appointing a consumer duty champion, so to ensure that the principles of the duty are followed by the firm, and ideally someone who's maybe a step removed from the board to make sure that they're held accountable. So it tends to be a NED who we've kind of recommended who would be the consumer duty champion. So someone who stepped back from the day-to-day operation and can fully focus on the actual implementation of consumer duty going forward. It's also important to note that there needs to be ongoing training relating to the consumer duty as well. So lessons learned from previous interactions with customers to make sure that staff are trained in the best ways to interact with certain types of customers, certain characteristics that people are displaying where they need to be treated more sensitively in terms of vulnerability, as we've kind of previously touched on. And the firm should also be collecting MI, which can be monitored in relation to the consumer duty. I noticed there's been a question around that in the Q&A, which we can come on to in a second. But when relating to consumer support, the ease at which customers are able to get an outcome they're looking for should be tracked. Additionally, complaints made about the clarity or ease of communication channels should be monitored and actioned. And that can also be stuff that can be carried over to training processes as well to make sure that that is something that is improved on going forward, because that is something the SEO will be looking to see that, you know, once consumer duty is in place, it's not just a box ticked, that firms are consistently looking to improve their approach to improving outcomes for consumers as well. I think, as I mentioned earlier on, it's really important to just put yourself in the shoes of a consumer. So I know, as I say, a point I made earlier, but what level of support or service would you be looking for in a similar situation, putting yourself in the customer's kind of individual circumstances as well? And maybe not being individuals who can necessarily withstand the pressures of not getting the outcome that they're looking for. So support channels need to be, you know, easy, accessible, and readily available for customers to get the support that they're looking for as well.
Yeah, so it seems like get your champion in place, make sure you've got that board level support, you've got those MI data points and those kind of things. I mean, Anthony, do you want to give a 10-second just on some of the MI data points just to answer that question very briefly?
It kind of varies, but some good ones, particularly in terms of something we've touched on today around ease of onboarding a customer versus ease of a customer being able to leave. If it's an online onboarding process and leaving process, kind of the number of clicks that's required for a customer to onboard is something really, really important. Like the number of screens they have to see to get onboarded versus offboarded is something that, you know, can give you an indication of how easy it is for both of those things to take place. Obviously, feedback from customers as to how easy or difficult it has been for interaction to take place is very, very useful as well. The number of incorrect products signed up for. So if your communication channels are really good, that should in theory be a minimum. You want to make sure that people are signed up for the right thing and they're not thinking 2 weeks later, this isn't what I signed up for, I need to change it. Also in terms of your communication, if there's a way to track the number of emails that have been opened, if that's a communication channel that you're investigating. So if that's the only way you've decided to engage with customers, which shouldn't necessarily be the case, but if that's a main one and you can see that only a small percentage have been opened, then that's something that you need to follow up on to make sure that all customers are informed of something that's important. I've got a long list, but I won't use all of them. But there's some kind of,
we've only got 30 minutes for this. Yeah.
10 seconds.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and gave you, we answered one of the questions in the Q&A there, just really looking at what sort of MI data points could we start to collect. So hopefully that's a few to think about. But I do want to just get through this final question. So this one is one for Matt to round us off. So do individuals throughout your firm, including those in control and support functions, understand their role and responsibility in delivering the duty?
Yeah, so another one from the FCA, and I think perhaps where I'd want to drill down into this question is one of the points that you just raised then, Anthony, which is around training. So realistically, this is the best way to ensure that individuals within the business or across the business understand what consumer duty is, the changes that are being made, and what this means moving forward. So perhaps if I just sort of drill down into maybe how you would do this, and I think that the first step I would introduce here would be face-to-face training with your management team, relevant individuals there, so that they really understand what consumer duty is, what processes and controls are in place, what steps have been taken as part of this implementation period, and then what that means going forward. So focus on your management team. Following that, it would then be, right, let's roll this session out to all employees. And the reason why you train management first is that the employees then may go to their direct line managers and ask for perhaps more clarity rather than doing it in a large training session. And that sort of continual support process will allow for those sort of more intricate questions to be answered at a lower level, but whilst also being open to that across the business. So I'd say that was kind of sort of stage one of training and rolling it out. The second part would be looking more at sort of practical measures. So this would be operationally, how are we going to achieve X, Y, Z? Now that might be for consumer support, new scripts, which cover various different items. And that would be rolled out potentially by line managers who've received more bespoke training there. So from the kind of theoretical, practical, overarching training, we go into those practical measures, and those are all rolled out accordingly. I think then another way of training and another way of evidencing competency is then by going into more of a kind of modular, potentially online assessment, some sort of training platform, where you have more structured training to understand and actually evidence that individuals haven't just sat there and listened and it's gone one ear out the other. We've actually got evidence that people understand and the employees understand consumer duty, what the firm is trying to roll out here and how that's going to be implemented. So I'd say that was another stage of training which should be factored in and considered, and then create an open door policy as well. So that people can come back through and ask any additional questions that they need to, and then that all falls into your ongoing monitoring as well.
So that nicely wraps up our session. So whatever we've spoken about today, instead of sort of data points and customer feedback, etc., but at the heart, we need to make sure people know what they're doing and they have been trained, and that's a really good 3-step approach that you outlined there. So now we're going to go back to the slides, and I'm going to wrap up for the session, very unfortunately, for our final sessions. This was the last one of our 4-part series. So all of our recordings are on our website and our LinkedIn account. Very similar to the previous sessions we've done, obviously, we're offering all attendees a suite of consumer duty documentation at a significantly discounted rate. So we've got our consumer duty implementation plan and our consumer duty policy. So please do get in touch. We've got specific documents across payments, investments, credit, mortgage, insurance firms. Usually priced at £2,600 plus VAT, but we're doing a little cheeky discount for £1,300. So we'll send out an email after this session if that's of interest. Again, if you've got any other questions, our team can support you with anything to do with consumer duty. We've got all of our contact information here on the screen, so we can support with your arrangements, implementation support, framework reviews, ongoing support. We are here for you for sure. So finally, to wrap up, nicely on time for this one, So thank you to all of our excellent attendees for today's webinar. Really, really good discussion today. Again, recordings will all be online, so watch back if you fancy it. So thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of the day.